Well, it is so great to be with all of you. I'm Congressman Jared Huffman, and we are, thank you. We're going to have a busy hour and a half together, but I've got a special way to start this town hall off. We have the San Marin Jazz Choir, and I'd like to ask them to come forward. And I hope all of you will join me in saluting our flag as they perform the Pledge of Allegiance. Do you need this? Did I say the Pledge of Allegiance? National Anthem. Sorry. We're going to do the National Anthem. And you don't need this?
Yeah, we do.
Okay. Great.
And our soprano didn't show up, so feel free to sing along, okay? Ready?
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
All right, the San Marin High School Jazz Choir. Thank you, folks. Wish I could sing like that. So, folks, great to see this crowd. We threw this town hall together on very short notice because there's a lot of big things that are going on these days, and I wanted a chance to talk with you about those things. I love doing town halls. So I've done 45 town halls since Donald Trump was elected. And that has enabled us to engage with over 20,000 constituents during that time. And that's in addition to other kinds of town halls we do. We do a whole bunch of school town halls with high schools and middle schools, for example. And we do workplace town halls like the one I did this week for the staff and the board members and volunteers at Guide Dogs for the Blind right here in San Rafael. So we wanted to put this one together on short notice. That happened about a week or so ago. My staff is getting really good at doing this sort of thing. Thank you. And that was before we knew that PG&E would shut off the power to 160,000 of my constituents. So we added that to the list of things to talk about. And that was before we knew that President Trump would have this bizarre decision to abandon our Kurdish allies to Turkey on no notice whatsoever. And I'm sad to report that they are being killed by a Turkish military invasion as we speak. And that was before we woke up to yesterday's news that two of Rudy Giuliani's Ukrainian clients, who are at the heart of this whole Ukraine scandal that is unraveling the Trump presidency, were arrested as they were trying to sneak out of the country with one-way tickets to Vienna. So that happened. And that was before we knew about today's huge bombshell ruling by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals that Donald Trump's accounting firm Mazars has to produce all sorts of financial records, including tax returns, that he has been desperately trying to keep secret for the last several years. So the news moves very fast these days, as you know, and we started out with a lot to talk about, and just in the last few days, we got a lot more to talk about. Before we dive into that, and I want to get to your questions as quickly as possible, let's talk a little bit about the flow of this event. I'm going to make some brief opening remarks, and then we're going to turn to whatever questions you want to talk about. But because we have so many folks and we want to cover everybody if we can, the way we've found that works best is to use index cards for those questions. So some of you have already started filling them out. Those are the veterans that know how these town halls work. At any point in this event, if you want to ask a question and fill out a card, just raise your hand, and my staff will be circulating with index cards, and then just hand it back. Here's how this will work. My district director, Jenny Calloway, is right down here. She's great. You should applaud for Jenny, because she's great. She is going to receive those index cards. Now, we're not going to filter it. We don't filter. We'll answer anything you want to talk about here today. But what we might do is consolidate questions that are kind of covering the same thing over and over again. That way we cover as much ground as possible. And then she will read those questions to me, and we will hopefully get through everything that was proposed to be asked. If you came here with a question and we can't get to it, I do promise we'll get back to you. And one way or the other, we will get you an answer or some feedback, because we want to make sure to commit to do that. Now, just to set the stage a little for our conversation, what a difference having the majority in Congress makes. Can you imagine where our country would be right now had the 2018 midterm election not turned out the way it did? Because the people of the United States sent new people to Congress to provide a check and balance on the executive, we were able to allow Bob Mueller to actually complete his investigation. That wouldn't have happened. We were able to bring that report forward for the public to see, at least most of it. That would not have happened. And of course, we would not have ever learned about this scandal involving the Ukraine. That came forward through a whistleblower who would have absolutely been shut down by this administration. They tried to do it, but without one branch of Congress there to listen and protect this whistleblower and help bring this story forward, we would not know anything about how the President of the United States and those around him violated their oath of office, put our national security at risk, and invited a foreign power to interfere in the 2020 election. Because of the information that we have brought to light just in the first 9 months of this Congress, there is an impeachment proceeding moving forward with support from a majority of the House of Representatives. And all right, and just in the last 2 weeks, a subject that was written off as politically impossible has now suddenly gained a majority support of the American people. Public opinion is shifting and shifting rapidly. Because of the information we've already brought forward, legal scholars and experts are calling for impeachment. Just today, 17 former Watergate prosecutors wrote a statement that they believe we already have prima facie evidence of impeachable abuses of power. And it's more than just Democrats. I want to emphasize this. It's a lot more than just Democrats. Separately, 16 former prosecutors from Republican administrations came forward and said the same thing, endorsing the impeachment process. We have 3 Republican governors calling for impeachment. And we have a whole bunch of Republican former governors. And from George Will to Bill Kristol to George Conway, there is a growing chorus of Republican leaders around this country calling for impeachment. I want you to know that I agree with them. And I say that in a very sober way. There's nothing to celebrate or be happy about on this subject. It's a sad thing. It's a tragic thing that we even have to face this moment for our country. But we will proceed with the seriousness that this moment deserves and that the Constitution requires. I promise you that. We will conduct a methodical, thorough, and factual investigation following the facts and uncovering the full extent of what happened, and this president will be held accountable. Our House will protect our oath of office. Our oath of office is, of course, to protect the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic, and no one is above the law. Now, just one last thing before we dive into your questions. One other way in which having the majority in this Congress has made a tremendous difference is in our ability to legislate. And I know that impeachment does kind of get all the headlines, and the news cycles tend to center on that. But it's important to know that we have made huge progress on really important policy priorities. And that begins with the first bill this Congress passed, H.R. 1, which was the most sweeping campaign reform, ethics reform, election integrity bill ever to pass a House of Congress. It was our first act in this new Congress, and it has been sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. We've also taken some initial actions to try to bring down the cost of prescription drugs, and you're going to hear a lot more about that. We are right now finalizing a very comprehensive and ambitious prescription drug bill that I think will mean a lot to the American people as we grapple with the price of drugs. We've passed legislation to protect dreamers from deportation, to guarantee equal pay for women, and to provide full civil rights protection for the LGBTQ community. We've passed legislation to put the United States back in the Paris Climate Accord. And we've passed two bills that I have worked on for the last couple years and was able to help shape this year. And I'm happy to say both were bipartisan. The two parts are protecting the Arctic refuge from drilling. And the other is a permanent ban on drilling off both the Pacific and Atlantic coast. So, don't let anyone tell you that all they're talking about is impeachment. We are actually legislating quite a bit. We need to get the Grim Reaper over in the Senate involved in calling these things forward to a vote. Finally, we never stop working on a whole host of local priorities. Right now, there's obviously none greater than PG&E's power outages. So I do want to report to you, as my last comment before we take your questions, that I spoke today with the CEO of PG&E. I can tell you that they believe all power will be restored to all of my constituents, probably by now, but at least sometime tonight. You just got a text? All right, well, that's kind of the way this has gone, isn't it? He also asked me, I asked him, what should I tell my constituents who are pretty upset over this? I mean, I've got a lot of angry constituents, and I'm upset myself. He said the most important thing he would like for me to say on his behalf is whatever beef you have with PG&E, and we're all mad at PG&E because they got us into this mess, be nice to the line workers. They are out there working very hard to get power back on. And I think that's an important point worth all of us considering. They have had workers insulted and one even shot at. That's not okay, folks. We will bring accountability to PG&E. We will get answers to the tough questions about why such a broad net had to be cast with these power outages. But in the meantime, let's do respect the line workers that are just trying to get the power back on. Okay, so with that, let's dive into your questions. Jenny is going to do a dramatic reading of these questions.
Okay, so the most popular questions have been about impeachment, which you have addressed. So I'm going to.
I can address it more.
I'm going to bring up those in a minute,
Okay.
but let's just switch gears here to how do we protect DACA students?
DACA students, how do we protect them? It's a super important question, especially because the Supreme Court has taken review of the case that will decide this term whether President Trump can rescind the DACA program and basically subject hundreds of thousands of young people that I consider Americans to summary deportation. We've got to protect these young people. So the easiest way to do it is for Mitch McConnell to simply bring forward the bill we've already passed out of the House with bipartisan support and protect them legislatively. All right, Donald Trump has even said that he was open to signing a bill if Congress acted to protect DACA. Okay, so that's the easiest way. The second way would be to make sure we win that court case. That's a little bit iffier when you come to, this is kind of an untested new Supreme Court that is that is full of two recent Trump appointees that could take things the wrong way. The third way is the 2020 election, right? Making sure that we elect people to federal office that are committed to comprehensive immigration reform, but also specifically to protecting the dreamers.
Okay, I'm going to combine two questions here. I'm bothered by your support, along with the Koch brothers, of businesses, Oyster Farm Cattle within Point Reyes. You are losing the trust of conservatives, conservationists, sorry. Point Reyes is a park for we the people. I'm tired of subsidizing ranchers that are not viable. There are many successful ranchers not on our park property. Long live the elk. A truly dedicated national and a truly dedicated national park program. And then the follow-up, and also related, okay. Please reconsider killing native Tule elk in Point Reyes National Seashore. Tule elk are California endemic species found only in California. Point Reyes National Seashore is the only national park with our native Tule elk, and our party represents protecting native species.
All right, I think both parties should represent that. If I miss any part of that, Jenny, remind me to cover all of those points, because there were several things tucked into that. I could probably fill up this town hall talking about the Point Reyes National Seashore and the complex set of issues that right now is being addressed by an update to the Park Service's General Management Plan. But I think if I could try to boil it down to something a little more concise, what the issue seems to come down to for many people is, should we continue to allow about 24 multi-generational family ranchers to continue operating under leases that occupy about 1/3 of the national seashore? All right, so that's the question. And I am of the view that we should, and I will tell you why. I believe every park is unique, every park is different, and you have to sort of look at what its mission and purpose and objective is. Some parks are all about just wilderness, or just recreation, or just historic preservation. We've got battlefields, obviously, that are not meant to be ecological preserves. Point Reyes is fundamentally unique, and I think it's one of the reasons most of my constituents just love it. It's special. It is this mosaic of different things. Certainly it includes a lot of wilderness, and there's several times more wilderness area than there is agricultural area preserved in the Point Reyes National Seashore. It's obviously got recreational values and some incredible historic landmarks that are preserved. But one of the primary reasons we got this great national seashore was the ag land in Point Reyes was under threat of development. This is essential to the whole story of Point Reyes and what it was intended to protect against and to preserve. And Congress, in buying out those development rights, but also promising to let those multi-generational ranchers continue in an area specifically designated as the pastoral zone, okay? This was meant to preserve these working landscapes as part of the culture and unique history of Point Reyes. That was the deal. And any number of times since the early 1960s, Congress has reaffirmed that, as recently as last year. Bipartisan act of Congress. Presidents of different administrations have signed off on this. So the real question is, do you want to continue with this mosaic nature and character of the Point Reyes National Seashore? I do. Or do you want to get all the agriculture out of the seashore? And I respect the fact that some do. Yep. All right. So I'm gonna try to answer your. I hear you. Yeah. So listen, please let me try to answer your question, okay? I am telling the truth. All right, folks. This is challenging, but look. Here's the deal, elk. Let's talk specifically about elk. We also have these wonderfully vital elk herds in Point Reyes. Now, some have characterized the preferred alternative that the Point Reyes has, that the National Park Service has come up with as an elk killing, evict the elk option in order to protect highly subsidized ranchers. And these are the sort of, I think, hyperbolic terms that get thrown around. Let me tell you the truth about that alternative. It calls for more elk than we have today, not less. Okay? And in fact, it calls for acknowledging a new third elk herd at Drake's Beach. The challenge there is that's right in the middle of some ranches and dairies. So it's going to create some management challenges, right? And if you look anywhere where elk have been reintroduced and managed, you occasionally have some of these conflicts. So I'm working with the Park Service, and I am urging them not to kill elk. I don't think they have to do a lot of culling or killing in order to manage this situation, but I think they do need, if we want these ranchers to have a chance at continuing, they got to use some fencing, they got to be strategic and maybe do some relocation of some of these animals, and they can't let the herd get too big. They're talking about 120 animals in a new herd, and that's on top of the Limmentor herd and on top of the Pierce Point herd. So when people tell you there'll only be 120 elk while these ranchers get leases, they're only counting one of 3 herds, folks. There's going to be hundreds and hundreds of elk, and they are thriving, and we like that. It's a good thing. But we got to be smart in the way we manage it, all right? That's my answer. Did I cover all of them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, switching gears, as a member of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, what are you doing to frame climate solutions so they're suitable enough for Republican votes needed for passage? If you believe Republicans cannot be convinced to vote for a climate plan, what is your plan B?
So I like the way that question was framed, and it's something that I have struggled with. I would love to make climate change a bipartisan issue. There was a time when conservation issues used to be broadly bipartisan. In fact, just today I was at a lunch celebrating a former Republican assemblyman from Marin, Bill Bagley, who used to be a pretty darn good environmentalist. And we used to have Republicans like that cared deeply, they had conservation values. Environmental issues generally and climate change specifically have really been radicalized in recent years. And nowhere is that more true than in Washington. So I certainly have Republican colleagues that I can talk to about pieces of the climate challenge, specifically about adaptation, because many of them represent coastal communities or other places where the effects, the reality of climate change are so obvious and real that they can no longer just deny it, right? So they've sort of evolved, and they're ready to talk about, mitigation and adaptation. They don't like to use the term climate change. They prefer extreme weather. But that's progress. Here's the problem. The IPCC tells us we have a global crisis and about a decade to get it fixed, and focusing on adaptation does nothing to decarbonize the economy and to rapidly get us off fossil fuel. That's the part we got to do in the next 10 years. And I don't have time to bring every Republican along when it comes to decarbonizing the economy. I hope there are a few that will work with me on that, but it's tough. And many of them are from fossil fuel states where it's just very hard for them to push back against the fossil fuel industry. So I will certainly keep trying and keep listening. If any of you know Republican members of Congress that you think I can work with on this, let me know. I'd love to do it. But right now, when it comes to pushing back on the fossil fuel industry, which is the core of what we have to do, and we got to do it right now, really fast, we've got to essentially put an end to the fossil fuel era. I don't know any Republicans that are ready to do that. So we just got to move on without them. Yeah.
Okay. Why didn't you mention the successful first phase China-USA trade agreement which Trump made today? Trump is the one who got this done. No Democrats ever took on China or North Korea. Hang on, we're respectful here. This is a question someone in this audience is asking. Only Trump. Your impeachment hearings are just a political ploy to defeat Trump.
Okay. Hey, no, it's okay. Look, I appreciate the question, and I'm glad that there are some folks here that have different political views than me. That it makes for just a better conversation, right? And I want it to be a respectful one. Let me just correct one thing, though, about the question. There was a statement that this breakthrough trade agreement was reached today. I hate to disappoint you, but it wasn't. There was kind of a press event today. And when you drill into the specifics, you find that like so many other things with this administration, there's no there. At the end of the day, all there was an agreement to have more talks. All right, and I'm glad we have an agreement to have more talks. But we have seen this movie a lot with this president. He will come out of some, pop-up summit with Kim Jong-un and declare that they've had a breakthrough agreement on denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, and you've come to find out there's no agreement of any kind. Nothing specific. So sadly, while I am happy to push back on China, and like so many things, what Trump is trying to do with China, the core of what he's trying to do is not wrong, all right? How he's doing it is a mess. And that's the case with all of his trade blustering. We do need better trade agreements. We do need to do a better job protecting American workers. I would add in protecting the environment and making sure that climate change is part of these agreements. But we just haven't been able to deliver completed agreements. We've had a lot of press events, and I'll believe it when I see it. I hope I'm wrong. I hope he can achieve a really good quality, comprehensive trade agreement with China. It would be a good thing.
All right, so Jeff asks, why on Fox News does Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida refer to his friend moderate Democrat Jared Huffman of New Jersey?
Yeah.
Just some levity.
I don't know, but I was really amused when I saw that too, both that I was referred to as a moderate. I'm pretty flaming liberal, folks, and there's no mystery about that, but also that I was from New Jersey. So I guess, if anything, it's a bit of a heads up that when you hear Matt Gaetz saying anything, don't take it at face value.
Okay. So Gary asks, why don't the Democrats get a court judgment against the IRS Commissioner and Secretary of the Treasury for breaking the law by not releasing Trump's tax returns to the House Ways and Means Committee, and then put both of them in jail because a fine will mean little to them?
Okay. Well, there's a couple of issues there. First, there's the substantive issue of the Ways and Means Committee's attempts to get the tax return. And there is, of course, this specific 100-year-old statute that is very clear. It just says when the Ways and Means Committee asks for the tax return, the IRS commissioner shall provide it, right? There's no ambiguity in that whatsoever, but the Trump administration has kind of invented all sorts of immunities and legal defenses, and the one that they've been raising against this particular effort is that there's no legitimate legislative purpose, and I guess Donald Trump gets to determine what a legitimate congressional legislative purpose is. Okay? So here's the deal. Today you may have seen that the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals issued a decision. Now, it was on a separate issue. It was about the Oversight Committee's attempts to get Mazur's financial records, and that's because of emoluments clause and conflicts of interest and other corruption issues, but it addressed the exact same issue, whether there was a legitimate legislative purpose, and it was a big win for the Democratic majority. The court dismissed the administration's arguments, kind of dismissed this whole notion that Donald Trump gets to decide what is a legitimate purpose for Congress, which is kind of offensive at its core. And I believe that precedent, and I read the opinion today, even with this Supreme Court, I have a hard time believing that opinion isn't pretty airtight. That means we're going to get the tax returns. I say that with some confidence now. Now, the second part of that question was about whether Congress could simply throw the IRS commissioner in jail or something like that. That's where we're pretty limited in the tools that we have. Congress can hold people in contempt, but there's sort of two remedies for that. One is you go to Attorney General Bill Barr and you ask him to enforce your contempt ruling. Probably not going to happen. The other is you try out some really old authorities that haven't been used in over 100 years, where we might use this inherent contempt concept and actually have the Capitol Police, I guess, sneak up on the IRS commissioner and throw him in the brig. That too that's pretty unlikely. We'll see. I mean, the stonewalling is pretty extreme, so we're going to have to consider extreme measures, but I doubt that you'll see it come to that.
Okay. Hank asks, would you consider introducing a constitutional amendment that would prevent the president from pardoning members of his administration and his campaign? Otherwise, the president will have his people commit crimes endlessly.
Yeah, that's a great question. We've already seen, I think, abuse of the pardon process from this president. I think we need to revisit that. Now, the problem is the pardon power is in the Constitution, right? And so I'm certainly willing to push my legislative authority as far as I can to put some sideboards on it. I think you could argue that abuse of the pardon power is an abuse of power that is an impeachable offense, but that kind of gets you right back to where we already are. It doesn't stop a president from misusing that power. I think the only thing that probably could do that is a constitutional amendment. And I'll tell you, if you wanted to see a constitutional amendment on this subject, Donald Trump may well give us the political motivation to see one, because in the months ahead, it wouldn't surprise me at all if we see a whole bunch of pardons and cross pardons maybe between two certain individuals. So stay tuned.
Okay, Nancy wants to know, please explain exactly how we the people can enact a law banning all military weapons for citizens' use, period. No automatic guns, no semi-automatic weapons, no weapon larger than needed for usual hunting purposes. This is the will of the people, and the people are not able to enact law.
So yeah, let's talk about gun violence. And I should have mentioned this at the outset. One of the other things that we already have legislated on in this House was something that has been a third rail for a long, long time in Washington. We actually passed gun control reform, gun violence reform, in the form of universal background checks and closing what is referred to as the Charleston loophole. That bill also is sitting in the Senate on Mitch McConnell's desk, and that bill is overwhelmingly popular with the American people. I mean, to the tune of like 80+% of the people support what we're trying to do with that bill. Now, this question is more specifically aimed at assault weapons, and we know that the weapon of choice in these mass shootings is things like the AR-15, and we know that these extra capacity magazines and the incredible firepower of these weapons is what enables sick people to hurt so many people in an incredibly short amount of time. The shooting in Dayton, Ohio a few weeks ago, I believe it was a couple of dozen people shot, and it happened in less than a minute. So, yeah, try that with a handgun. So, it wasn't. All right, it was an extended magazine weapon, and that's what we need to deal with. So both the AR-15 style assault weapon, which was designed for one reason, to kill people, and also the extended magazines that can be used in handguns but are often used in assault rifles, I think should be banned. And I guess that's the answer. I think they should be banned.
Okay. Teresa wants to know, how can we ensure the EPA does not roll back tenets of the Clean Water Act with their new rules, i.e. the 401 certification by states?
401 certification by the state? Yeah, so I'm not sure which specific rollback this is referring to. There's a whole bunch of moving parts right now from the EPA and Interior, and there's a lot of rolling back of environmental standards underway. I know every one of these things will be challenged in court if they're not already being challenged in court, and so far from what I've seen, the scientific basis for a lot of these decisions by the Trump administration is really vulnerable. They don't have good science when they, say that this pesticide that's proven to be a carcinogen is just fine. Go and use it. Or when they roll back the Endangered Species Act in the ways that they've proposed to do. So we're going to challenge those things in court, and my expectation is those court cases will prevent a lot, if not all, of these regulatory rollbacks from being finalized. That should get us into the next administration and the next Congress when we can actually permanently stop these rollbacks. But I think it's going to be legal challenges for now. And the state of California, we should all feel very good about this. The state of California is leading the fight. I can't remember how many times Javier Becerra has sued Donald Trump, but it's remarkable.
Okay, what is your solution this is from Sue. What is your solution that will most contribute to climate change reduction? Mine is EVs, reduce carbon by 50%. How do you plan to promote the adoption of EVs when we take all three branches?
When we get the trifecta.
Optimistic, yeah.
That is what it's going to take, by the way, so it's a pretty good way to frame the question. If we want to do everything we have to do to confront the climate crisis, you are going to need all three branches of government unified in doing this. And even then, it's probably going to require a lot of work, and it's going to be a heavy political lift. But we got to do it. And so the question is, what is the most important thing? I guess I would say this. When you look at the biggest emitting sectors for greenhouse gases, it used to be energy, but energy is now second. And the reason for that is that we've been bringing emissions down by getting rid of coal, unfortunately, often replacing it with cheap natural gas, fracked gas. And the more we learn about that, the more we find that natural gas is not this clean bridge fuel that has been advertised, right? If you actually look at the whole life cycle of extraction and distribution and the burning of natural gas, there is a point, I think it's at about a 4% leakage rate, where natural gas is just as bad for the climate as coal. Right? And we've been patting ourselves on the back a lot with natural gas. And fracking is bad for other reasons, that's right. So I am really trying to urge us to move beyond natural gas and get to 100% non-fossil clean energy. But energy is coming, our emissions are coming down, wind and solar have gotten cheap, and a lot of the new generation these days is wind and solar. So there's a pretty good story to tell. We got to speed it way up. Transportation is now the #1 emitting sector. And the problem there is that the fossil fuel industry kind of still has us by the short hairs. We still, because we haven't been able to electrify vehicles and heavy equipment and trucks, we're kind of at their mercy. And they have been the ones driving the Trump administration to roll back the clean car standards and to fight the state of California on our clean car waiver under the Clean Air Act. It hasn't been the car industry. Car manufacturers are ready to work with us, but the oil and gas folks that run the Trump administration, they understand what's at stake. If we quickly electrify transportation, they're pretty much done. But that's exactly what we need to do. So I would say the most important, short answer, the most important thing we can do is electrify our transportation sector as quickly as possible.
Okay, Robert wants to know, what is your position on universal health care?
Let's get some index cards to the shouters in the back. I'm happy to answer your question. I only ask that you behave yourself, okay? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yay. So what is your position on universal health care? If in favor, how will the federal government pay for it?
Okay. So I do support universal health care. I'll be a little more specific than that. That to me doesn't mean everybody can buy a plan if they can afford it. It means health care is a human right, and we provide it to everyone in the country. So there are a number of ways to get there. I think the ultimate ideal, the goal, is Medicare for all. We have a very successful health insurance program in Medicare. People love it. I think a lot of people in this room are Medicare recipients, just looking around here. And my guess is that you are pretty happy with your Medicare. And I think we should make it available to everyone, right? I guess the question, and we're seeing this play out in the presidential debate, it's one of the big issues. Do you go all the way there right away? And that's sort of the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and a few other model. Or do you do something more incremental that's basically building on the framework of the Affordable Care Act? My answer is, if I can get there all the way right away, I'd love to do it. Let's try. But if I can make Medicare available to everybody 50 and over, that's a great incremental step toward Medicare for all. If I can have Medicare or Medicaid available on the exchange as a public product that can compete with private health plans and give choice and coverage to a lot more people, I'd love to do that too. So I will take any incremental step I get towards universal coverage and towards that ultimate goal of Medicare for all.
Okay. And on a related note, Gary asks, why doesn't Congress admit 72% of premium to the health care they receive and introduce a health care bill similar to their benefits? This should make news. Anyone that doesn't support it should be voted out.
All right, let's talk about congressional health care benefits. But first, I realize I failed to answer the last part of that question, which is how you're going to pay for it.
Yeah, pay for
Right?
it. Pay for it.
I wasn't trying to duck that part of the question, I promise. That is the hardest part of the question because it's expensive, right? Healthcare is expensive. Healthcare costs have been climbing. But the good news is this: we're already paying for it. We're paying for it in healthcare premiums that go to the private insurance sector, and that includes their significant profits. So I think we have an opportunity, if you want to go all the way to Medicare for all, to simply pay for it through a tax. I'll be honest about that. And it could be any combination of payroll or income or other taxes, and then save people a whole bunch of money on healthcare premiums that they don't have to pay. So you're going to pay for it one way or the other. I would simply substitute a tax revenue, a tax payment mechanism for the current premium payment mechanism, and at the end of the day, there are going to be efficiencies that should mean we pay a lot less. And that's because we're going to get everybody into one giant risk pool. And that is a heck of a lot better than the current Medicare risk pool, which is, I'm sorry folks, mostly older and sicker people, right? So by bringing the whole population into that program, those efficiencies are going to bring costs way down. And I think it'll be the pay for is actually, it can be a very good part of this story.
Okay, and did you talk about the congressional health care plan?
Oh, congressional health care plan. So, listen, I hate to disappoint folks who get these things on the internet, and they suggest to you that the minute I'm sworn in Congress, my kids' student loans are forgiven, and I get full pay pension at retirement and gold-plated health plans that give me, cosmetic surgery. Look at me, right. Yeah. Here's the truth. I've got a middle-of-the-road Kaiser plan under the Affordable Care Act. Congress is the only part of the whole population in this country that by law has to buy their insurance under the Affordable Care Act. We got to go on Obamacare. So, sorry to disabuse you of whatever's swirling around the internet. I keep seeing it every few months, and it keeps being false.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of questions about PG&E, but this is a good one that synthesizes what the questions are. This is from Lenny. Given the percent of shutdowns of power by PG&E, would you please give us your opinion regarding the breakup of public utilities and making them a non-for-profit entity, maybe reassigning their dividends to better support improving the infrastructure?
So thanks for that question. This is asking for my opinion, so I generally don't lack for opinions. I will give it to you. But just know that I am your representative in Washington, and it's really much more of a state question. This is going to be the state PUC, possibly the state legislature, that decides what form PG&E takes and what its duties and obligations are going forward as it tries to come out of bankruptcy. I hope that there's a way to make PG&E emerge from all of this as a more publicly accountable entity of some kind. One possibility would be to reincorporate under a law that I got to write. Now I get to promote my own laws, right? When I was your state assemblyman, I wrote a law that created a new type of corporation called a California Benefit Corporation. And the neat thing about this is a lot of companies talk about corporate social responsibility, but at the end of the day, under law, their fiduciary duty legally requires them to maximize profits for shareholders. And that's the problem. So we created a new type of corporate entity where you redefine the fiduciary duty to include not just shareholders, but the environment and your workers and the community that you serve. And Patagonia was the first company to sign up as a California benefit corporation. And we've had, I know, over 100 corporations that have chosen to do that since that law took effect. I hope somewhere in the boardrooms and PUC deliberations and other places where this stuff is going to get hammered out, I hope someone is considering the option of PG&E reincorporating as a California benefit corporation, because I think it would go a long way towards addressing some of those concerns. Did I answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
there are over 700 public benefit corporations since that.
Oh, Jenny, yeah, there's over 700, thank you. That's why you're
700,
here. That's
yeah,
good staff
700.
work.
It's a good number. Okay, so Judy wants to know, are there any bills addressing term limits or age limits for Supreme Court justices? These are 3 questions, okay? Yeah. Limits on the number of justices that the president can appoint. Or 3, a nonpartisan board to provide list of justice names or decide on justice nominees. These are 3 different approaches.
Yeah. A nonpartisan board to provide a list of see, the Republicans have that. It's called the Federalist Society. But I don't think we want that. Short answer, no. There's no legislation that could actually do this because the Constitution provides right there for lifetime appointments for federal judges. Now, the Constitution also provides a remedy for judges that are bad, and that is impeachment. Once in a great while, a federal judge is impeached, but it takes a pretty extraordinary set of facts. And right now, I think it's highly unlikely that you'd see either legislation or a constitutional amendment that would change any of that. Now, another part of that question was the number of justices appointed.
Right.
And this is something where I know Pete Buttigieg on the campaign trail has suggested, well, maybe we'll just go back to FDR's playbook from the 1930s when he was having a hard time with a very conservative Supreme Court. This was, for those of you lawyers and law students out there, this was the era of substantive due process, where in the name of substantive due process, the Supreme Court was disallowing things like minimum wages and labor protections and just about anything that told business to do anything. It was deemed illegal under this expansive pro-corporation interpretation of the Due Process Clause. And it was so frustrating to FDR as he was trying to move the New Deal forward that he proposed stacking the court with a whole bunch of new justices. We didn't have to get there, thankfully, because the Supreme Court took note of where public opinion in the country was going. They backed off of their extreme substantive due process positions and began allowing pieces of the New Deal to move forward. But I think we don't need to add further chaos, I guess, to the institutions that we count on to hold this republic together. And I would be really nervous about setting the precedent of stacking Supreme Courts or doing any kind of games like that. Even if you could technically get away with it, that's the kind of stuff I'm trying to fight against with this administration. I'd hate to see us dignify those type of methods.
Okay. So Morgan wants to know, can you provide an update on the ocean marine environment, the status of offshore drilling, plans for the Pacific, and offshore and wind energy in our sanctuaries?
Okay. So at the big picture, we just got an international report that should be very sobering for anyone that cares about the health of our oceans. It turns out that the oceans are changing and warming and being damaged much faster than anybody thought. And the implications of that are breathtaking. So, in terms of energy development, which is one of the threats to the oceans, I told you that we've passed out of the House bipartisan bills to shut down new oil and gas leases on the Pacific and the Atlantic coast, and also to protect the Arctic. That's one step. I don't think right now we're in imminent threat of new drilling off the California coast. But with this administration, you just got to sleep with one eye open because they are always pushing oil and gas interests, all right? In terms of offshore wind, which I think was the last part of the question, I do think we have some opportunity. We have to find ways to develop more wind and solar. We have great wind resources off our shore. We got to be real careful about how we do it, and I don't think putting anything, even a wind project that might otherwise be supportable in the middle of a national marine sanctuary, is a good idea. I don't like the precedent of that because we are always fighting off other things that are proposed to commercialize national marine sanctuaries. And I don't like the fact that these sanctuaries are providing really critical refugia for fish, and they need it right now. It kind of goes back to the UN report that tells us we're in real trouble. You need these marine protected areas and these refugia so populations can stabilize as the climate changes. So I would be against siting in a marine sanctuary, but I'm very open to offshore wind if it's done properly. We've got a project up in Humboldt County that's actually being proposed by a local power authority, the Redwood Power Authority, with local leadership, local accountability. I think it could be done in a way that is very sensitive to the environment, also good for economic development there, and that's an example of one that maybe we should move forward with.
Okay. Peter wants to know, over 3,500 U.S. economists, including all Nobel laureates, federal chairs, Council of Economic Advisors, and professionals have endorsed a carbon price that's revenue neutral, fully refunded fee, dividend, and border adjustment. What's your position? And back up to that, what do you need to, another person is wanting to know related, what do you need to support HR 763?
That's the carbon fee and dividend bill. Okay, this comes up at every town hall because we have passionate people with the Citizens Climate Lobby among us, right? Okay. And they are focused like a laser beam on not just carbon pricing, but on this particular type of carbon pricing that they believe is a very elegant and thoughtful way to do it that basically would provide a revenue neutral carbon price and then refund a dividend to all Americans. So a couple things about that. First of all, there was a time when I think a lot of people wanted to believe that if we just priced carbon, if we just set a carbon tax or did a carbon fee, the market would take care of this climate problem and the economy would just adapt and we'd be good to go. I do not believe that. If you look at the places that have done carbon pricing, including here in California where we're doing it right now, you may not know it, but we have a carbon fee in place. It's part of a cap and trade program. That carbon pricing may be doing some good things, but it's not the main driver of greenhouse gas reductions. The things that are bringing greenhouse gases down anywhere you look in the world are things like performance measures, the clean car standards I talked about, clean energy standards, renewable portfolio standard here in California, efficiency standards, building codes. Those are the tools that are going to work the fastest, that we're going to work with the most certainty, and that I think we should prioritize. I think carbon pricing can and should be part of a comprehensive climate response. I hope we'll get a chance to do that in the next Congress. And I'll take a look at the fee and dividend model that is reflected in that bill. The reason I haven't co-sponsored that bill, Peter, you and your colleagues know this, it's because, and we see this a lot with carbon tax and carbon fee proposals, there's always a trap door, it seems. The trap door in this case is that it would require the EPA to freeze regulations under the Clean Air Act, and we can't do that because some of those things that I just described to you that are the most efficacious tools, we may need the EPA to actually regulate some of that. And so I can't give up EPA regulation in return for a carbon fee that may not solve the problem anyway, because places that have rolled them out often, it takes years for the market to adapt and for the fee to actually start working. So that's a pretty long-winded answer, but I think it tells you that I'm open to a fee as part of a broader comprehensive strategy, but I don't like trapdoors.
Okay. Here's a question from Gail. What committees are you on and what are your committees focusing on?
Thanks for that. So I'm on the Natural Resources Committee. That'll come as no surprise to any of you. I'm pretty focused on environmental and natural resource policy. I chair a subcommittee there called Water, Oceans, and Wildlife, and that to me is just the best thing I could ask for because I'm an old fisherman and a water wonk, and I love the chance to continue working on those policies in Washington. I'm also on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and that puts me in an interesting place because transportation, I told you, is one of the key pieces to the climate solution. But also, obviously, we have a dramatic need for infrastructure investments in this country. So I hope to have a hand in shaping something really big, maybe even transformative. I would even be willing to do it right now With President Trump, he has indicated at times he's indicated he wants to do something big on infrastructure. We can just never pin him down. So we'll keep trying in this Congress. Certainly by the next Congress, we've got to get this done. We've got trillions of dollars in infrastructure investments that are necessary. Then one last thing, I'm on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. So Speaker Pelosi assigned me to this project, which winds up in the end of March of next year. We have to produce a report. That's kind of our final work product. It won't be legislation specifically, but it will be a blueprint for what a legislative response to this climate crisis I've described should look like. And I'm pushing very hard to make it comprehensive and ambitious and even audacious. I know it's going to be hard to pass in this Congress with this Senate and this President, but there will be an opportunity. There has to be an opportunity in the years ahead to do this. So this blueprint, I hope, will help set the stage for that to happen.
Okay, what is the House position and yours on possible impeachment inquiries of Barr, Pompeo, Pence, and Kavanaugh?
Yeah. So don't tempt me. That's my... Look, impeachment is an extraordinary remedy, all right? As much as I think Barr has disgraced this country as the worst attorney general in history, as much as I think Pompeo is an embarrassment to the hardworking diplomats that represent us in the State Department, as much as I think Kavanaugh lied his way onto the Supreme Court, I think we've got to be focused here, and we've got to have a little bit of discipline in what we do with the political capital we have in this Congress in the months ahead, and I think it has to focus on the guy at the top, the president.
This was a two-part question by Nancy, but it was very different, the second part of the question, so here it is. She also wants to know about the status of government rebates and support for solar and alternative energy projects.
Yeah, so there are some federal tax credits that are set to expire this year, and I think that's probably what the question is alluding to. I believe there's strong bipartisan support for extending those tax credits. That's the minimum that we should be doing right now. We've been able to do it in the past, even under Republican Congresses with the Republican president. Well, no, not with the Republican president. The last time we did it was with Obama. But we did it under previous Republican presidents. And I hope that we can include that as part of year-end legislation, maybe the government funding bill, maybe the National Defense Authorization Act. One way or the other, we've got to make sure that those tax credit extenders are included in something before this year ends.
Okay. Okay, Heather asks, funding for education must be a top priority. National and state PTA support your bill for full funding of IDEA. PTA also supports common sense gun laws and background checks to protect our children, and we're opposed to proposed changes to SNAP as it would affect our children.
Great. Well, thank you, PTA, because that's awesome. I'm in favor of every one of those things. Let me dwell just for a moment on the special education piece, the IDEA. Now, federal politicians, presidential candidates, others, will often, when it comes time to talk about education, they'll say stuff like teacher pay and other things. The truth is, the top thing anyone in the federal government could do for public education, if you could do only one thing, is just fully fund the IDEA special education mandate. We passed this law a few decades ago with a promise that 40%, this is of course what requires public schools to provide a quality education to any kid regardless of mental or physical disability. And we passed that mandate with a guarantee, beware the word guarantee, that the federal government would pay 40% of the cost. The federal government has never come anywhere close to that. Today we're somewhere around 16% of the cost. And it's only because of a Herculean bipartisan effort that I've been part of in the last couple of years that we've gotten it up to that, because we were at 14% a couple years ago. So each year in the Congress, I introduce, because this is my #1 education priority, I introduce a bipartisan bill to put us on a pretty quick glide path to full 40% funding. And I want to report to those who care about this that we've got some good news in the last few weeks. For the first time, maybe ever, certainly since I've been around, we are going to get a hearing at the Education and Workforce Committee on this full funding bill, which has over 100 bipartisan sponsors. So there's a lot of momentum right now to get this done. Right?
Okay, if this focus is claiming interference in the 2020 election, why is this impeachment farce any different than Hillary's dossier interference in the 2016 election?
Can you read that again?
I'm trying to. I want to make sure
All
we
right.
get this there. If this focus is claiming interference in the 2020 election, why is this impeachment farce any
Okay.
different than Hillary?
I see. Okay.
Yeah, in the 2016.
So yeah, I guess the theory here, and with all due respect, I guess starts with the proposition that Hillary Clinton somehow did foreign interference in the 2016 election. So let's begin there. Don't take this from me, folks. I know some of you that are onto this issue don't trust what I say. You think I'm a Democrat and a partisan and I can't be trusted. So let me refer you to Republican Chairman Senator Burr of the Senate Intel Committee, and a bipartisan conclusion of that Intel Committee that came out just within the last week. It said unequivocally that the foreign interference in the 2016 election was exactly what Robert Mueller said it was. It was Russia. And even more, it said it was to help Donald Trump. And in fact, the Russian agents who were at the heart of that operation popped champagne bottles on election night, celebrating, saying that they had made America great again. So, yeah, I know, facts are stubborn. So, so all I say, don't believe me, you can ignore me, but go talk to Republican Senator Burr and the other Republicans on the Intel Committee, even if you don't believe lifelong Republican Bob Mueller, who came to the same conclusion. All right? So not a true set of facts at the heart of that question. Next question.
Okay, what's being done to protect the 2020 elections?
Not nearly enough is being done to protect the 2020 election. And we're obviously going backward because the President of the United States is inviting now multiple countries to actually get involved in interfering with the 2020 election. Don't believe me, just watch your television. It's right there. Believe your own eyes. It's right there, I promise you. Now, what is being done? Well, I mentioned the first bill that this new House majority passed, H.R. 1. It includes some very robust election integrity protections. Paper ballots, the kind of things that many folks who care about this want to see. We need to talk to Mitch McConnell about that because there is bipartisan support for many of these things. If you polled the American people, they really want to see us invest in this. We need to get a vote on either H.R. 1 or at least that part of H.R. 1, and it's up to Mitch McConnell to make that happen. If he doesn't do it, then it's really up to the individual states because that's where our elections are run, that's where our election systems are managed. And, you know, it's a real mixed bag. California, I feel like, has good leadership. I think our Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, is doing a great job protecting our elections. I cannot say that I have the same confidence for Georgia and Texas and any number of other places.
Okay. Patty wants to know if the Supreme Court sides with plaintiffs and the ACA is struck down, is there a plan B for families like mine with medically complex children? The loss of protection for pre-existing conditions and return of lifetime caps would be devastating.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, and that's so timely because the Supreme Court did take review of a case brought by Republican attorney generals that would invalidate the entire Affordable Care Act, and the Department of Justice, which had previously been opposing, even under Donald Trump, had been opposing that case, flipped and is now supporting the states that are trying to invalidate the Affordable Care Act. Now, here's the thing. They know that if that happens, if the Supreme Court says the Affordable Care Act is invalid, unconstitutional, null and void, enormous calamity would happen immediately in this country. So even our Republican Department of Justice is going to be asking the court to stay its own decision. In other words, let's just go ahead and continue to have an unconstitutional law for a while until we can figure this out, because they don't have a plan B. You've been hearing for years, repeal and replace, but when we called the question and they had the House and the Senate and the presidency, and they had it within their power to do what they promised they would do, repeal and replace in a way that protects pre-existing conditions and provides good quality care to everyone, they couldn't do it and they didn't have a plan. So the answer is there is no plan B right now. There is no plan B.
Okay, Irma wants to know, what can the House of Representatives do to help the Kurds?
What can the House do to help the Kurds? We have a limited set of tools on this. I'll be very honest. I know that when I get back to Washington next week, Chairman Elliot Ingalls of the Foreign Affairs Committee may well bring a resolution forward for a vote of the House condemning President Trump's decision. But President Trump's the commander-in-chief, and our ability to direct his decisions on things like this is fairly limited. We've tried to do it in other areas. For example, he just seems to love this Saudi war in Yemen, and it's a terrible humanitarian crisis. Both houses of Congress, on a strongly bipartisan basis, have passed legislation to get us out of that, and he has simply ignored it and continued. In fact, we just sent more troops to Saudi Arabia this week as part of that. So this is one of so many examples where we have an executive branch that is just not interested in following the law or what Congress says they should do. When I was a political science student a fair number of years ago, I remember studying the Nixon imperial presidency, right? And it was the case study of the sort of ultimate stress test on the checks and balances of our republic. And the republic worked, the system worked, right? The tests that we are seeing with this administration are so much more extreme than anything Nixon put us through. I mean, the president calling up the night before to try to tell an ambassador, you can't testify in that congressional hearing, even though you've been subpoenaed to do that. The president asserting this new thing that they just made up called absolute immunity, which can mean whatever I decide it means. The president repeatedly saying on television, again, believe your eyes and ears, not me. He said so many times, Article 2 of the Constitution means I can do whatever I want. Full stop. So we're in uncharted territory when it comes to checks and balances in this country, and the ability to rein in President Trump on this terrible decision with the Kurds in Syria is just one of a whole bunch of areas where we will keep trying, I promise. But it's going to be tough because this administration doesn't much care.
Okay, Dayton wants to know, for the first time in years, you voted in favor of the National Defense Authorization Act this year because it has some good provisions, including the repeal of the 2002 authorization for use of military force that presidents have used to bypass the Constitution and Congress to take us into foreign wars. The Senate Defense Bill does not contain this repeal. Yeah. Will you urge the House Conference Committee to fight to keep the repeal in the final bill?
Yeah. Great question. So I appreciate whoever asked this noticing that for the first time in the 7 years I've been in Congress, I actually voted yes on a National Defense Authorization Act. I've been voting no every year, and the reason I voted yes is not because I love our defense budget. The amount of defense spending authorized in that bill is still grossly inflated. It's way too much. But we were able to lock in so many critical, long-needed reforms in that bill. Everything from military sexual assault to stopping our participation in the war in Yemen, to not modernizing our nuclear forces to the tune of trillions of dollars, not developing new intermediate range nuclear missiles, staying in nuclear arms control treaties instead of pulling out of them. I mean, this bill is the most progressive Defense Authorization Act that I will ever see as a member of Congress, and it was too good for me not to support. Now, the problem is the Senate passed a pretty bad NDAA that doesn't include a lot of these reforms. The question, by the way, included one of the greatest parts of the bill. It repeals these old authorizations for the use of military force, which have been justifying wars all over the world for the last couple of decades. It's high time to get rid of that. So lots of reasons to like the House version of this bill, but none of this good stuff in the Senate version. And right now, we are in the conference committee where conferees from the House and Senate are kind of working out their differences. I have urged our conferees to hang on to all these good things, and we're just going to have to see what comes out.
Okay. Linda wants to know what's happening with the bipartisan group of legislators that you became a part of a few years ago. And the second question, given the stress of the days, what do you do for joy and gratitude for all that is good?
Okay. I think, Linda, you're referring to a group called the Problem Solvers Caucus, or No Labels, which when I first got to Congress, I thought sounded pretty great. I have always enjoyed the challenge of finding common cause and even unlikely alliances on tough public policy issues, and I've always thought the tone in Washington was too toxic, and I thought this may be the place where we do our part to change that. It was not to be. It turns out that No Labels is kind of a dark money organization. There was a lot of Coke money and other things funding it, and no surprise, we didn't really ever engage on anything unless it involved, kind of just bad stuff, frankly. And the Problem Solvers Caucus was largely something that members of Congress wanted to put on their resume, have in a brochure for their next election, but never actually try to solve problems together. So I pulled out. Yeah. I'm in the Democratic caucus now, and it's not perfect, but I think it's doing pretty well. Yeah.
Okay, Lawrence wants to know, is there any movement toward eliminating the Electoral College?
Yeah. So there is movement. There is this, obviously the Electoral College, if you wanted to make it go away, if you wanted to replace it with a national popular vote or something like that, you would need to amend the Constitution, but there's kind of a workaround that people have been working on at the state level that would pledge each state's electors based on popular vote outcome. It's a clever way to get around that problem, and we are now approaching the point where we almost have enough states to kind of create that 270 electoral vote threshold and have it work potentially. Here's the problem. That's a real popular thing as long as presidential elections are going, the popular vote is going the way you want it to go, right? As soon as the popular vote doesn't go the way you want it to go, a bunch of states are going to say, what the heck just happened? Get me out of this thing. So it's not very durable. It can be undone at the state level just as quickly as it can be created. I'm supporting it. I supported our efforts in California to be part of this, but I don't think anyone should believe that it's a long-term durable solution. It might be a temporary way to address electoral college anomalies, but we're probably going to have to amend the Constitution to really take care of this problem. Or just start winning elections with the Electoral College, which, that's kind of doable. We can actually do that. Yeah.
Okay. What is Congress prepared to do? Karen wants to know, what is Congress prepared to do if the Supreme Court rules in favor of allowing discrimination against LGBTQ Americans?
Congress, at least my side of Congress, is prepared to remind Mitch McConnell that we passed a full LGBT equality law and it's sitting on his desk. That is the answer, right? Because right now, we think that a court would take a look at our civil rights laws, which do protect gender, and we think that a court would say, well, yeah, that should be logically extended to gender preference, to the full LGBTQ set of factors. But if this Supreme Court disagrees and says it doesn't cover, then we're going to need to legislate. We're going to need to make very, very sure that Title VII and other federal civil rights laws include that full protection, and we're going to need Mitch McConnell or a new Senate to help us do that.
Okay. Skip wants to know, would you support a wealth tax?
Would I support a wealth tax? Sure. Yeah, I think our tax code has gotten very out of step with the concentration of wealth and income in this country, which is historically lopsided. So I'm not going to say I support an X% wealth tax at X threshold of income. I'm not sure what it should be set at. But we should absolutely raise the higher brackets. We should reinstate some of the higher bracket taxes that existed in the not too distant past, even under President Reagan, for example. I think that's obvious, and we're sitting on a $23 trillion debt. So at some point, unless we all want to get rid of Social Security and Medicare and transportation and everything else the government funds, we're going to have to tackle the revenue side of federal budgeting, and that is one of the obvious ways to do it.
Okay. Mark wants to know what limitations are placed on the House of Representatives after articles of impeachment are passed.
Limitations on the House?
What happens next?
So my understanding is that after articles of impeachment are passed, it moves over to the Senate. I don't think the House is precluded from continuing to investigate other things. That may be what the question is about. And I will just tell you my sense of how this thing's going to go. My sense is that in the next couple months, you're going to see a very narrow set of articles of impeachment that come forward based on the Ukraine scandal and probably based on obstruction of Congress. It may be just those two things. It may include a few other things. But those will then go to the Judiciary Committee for hearings and a formal vote, and if it passes out of the Judiciary Committee, it'll go to the full House for a vote. Obviously, then it goes to the Senate, and the Constitution requires the Senate to have a trial presided over by Chief Justice Roberts. But as that's happening, there's nothing to prevent the House from continuing to investigate tax returns and Deutsche Bank and emoluments clause and all kinds of other things where I think we continue to have a need for accountability, and I'll be pushing for all that.
Okay. So Bella wants to know, what should we be looking for in the debate next week? From your perspective, what are the characteristics of someone who could beat Trump?
You're going to get me in trouble here.
I'm wondering if I could ask that question.
Here's my view. I obviously have progressive politics. You know how I feel about climate and healthcare and any number of other things. So I like what I'm hearing from many of these candidates, a good, solid, progressive agenda, more than anything I think we've heard in any presidential election I can remember. But I think the other thing that we desperately need in this country is someone who can bring us together. And so I think what we should be listening for are the skills and the vision to unify a country that has just been ripped apart these last 3 years along ethnic and racial and partisan lines. So, here's the reality. Let's take, for example, Elizabeth Warren, who's doing really well right now. Obviously a super progressive agenda. If Elizabeth Warren is elected President of the United States with that super strong progressive agenda, she's still going to have to work with 2 houses of Congress that may not be ready to just rubber stamp every piece of that. So I think she's going to have to project, and other candidates that are progressive like her are going to have to project a certain pragmatism, right? And that can coexist with really passionate ideals. They really can coexist, folks, I believe. She's going to have to project the skill to build these majorities that are necessary to legislate and get things done. And she's going to have to somehow project the ability to assure wide swaths of the American people that are fighting with their neighbors and their family members and people at their church and synagogue that it's time for us to just cool down and try to come together, and maybe even to have a time when we don't have to worry about our president every single day. If any candidate can suggest that, that's going to be pretty important.
Okay. A number of people have asked, and Fern is the question I'm reading, what is the progress on affordable housing and the homeless situation in California?
Yeah, it's terrible. I know that there's a lot of effort at the state level to address this, and I support any kind of bonds, any legislation, any programs that will help provide affordable housing and also transitional housing to address this homelessness epidemic. At the lunch I told you I was at today, Mark DiCamillo was there. And of course he's a pollster of note. And he said that for the first time in all of his polling, homelessness just became #1. So we should all think about that and take note. We all know it's gotten a lot worse. We all know we have a housing crisis and a substance abuse crisis and a mental illness crisis and all of these elements that feed together into our homelessness crisis. But we have got to do a lot more to address it. At the federal side, where I represent you, I will certainly work on the pieces that I have jurisdiction over, and that's like veterans housing and HUD, which is woefully underfunded. I will work on providing much, much more money for mental health services and mental health parity. And we've got to do a lot more for substance abuse and addiction funding. So those are sort of the things that I see where I need to go fight those fights. But all of us are in this, frankly. Every local community and nonprofit, faith community, everybody's going to have to kind of find ways to be part of this solution.
Okay, you've addressed some of this, but not all of it. So Patty wants to know, can Congress compel the White House to comply with requests for documents, interviews related to the impeachment inquiry? Or if they continue to refuse, are the courts the only ones who can compel them? And what happens if they refuse the courts?
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary of the constitutional crisis we're in right now. So sure, Congress can compel by way of subpoena. If the subpoena is not complied with, there is a contempt order, and there theoretically are remedies for being in contempt of Congress. The problem is what I mentioned a while back. Attorney General Barr is the primary enforcement mechanism for those remedies. Now, if it's someone outside the administration, and this is where we've really seen overreach by the Trump administration. We've got folks that are not even in the administration where President Trump is saying, ignore the subpoenas, don't go. And they're saying, okay, sure, now what do we do? Okay, so there we might be able to use civil fines and penalties where we do have some direct authority, but we may also have to go to the court and use those processes. And we'll do all of it, but the good news is we got a great ruling today from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals that very strongly affirmed our authority to do all this and very strongly rejected the executive branch's position that they could just ignore it.
Okay. Okay, Katie says, thank you for your leadership on the California Wilderness Recovery and Working Forests Act. Outdoor Alliance represents 30,000 Californians and almost 500 in your district. We're passionate about this bill. We want to help support you.
Great.
Please let us know what our members can do to support you.
Thank you. So this is a bill I got to brag about here for a second. Now here in beautiful Marin, sometimes people don't get up to the Mendocino National Forest or to Humboldt County or Trinity County or Del Norte County, but we have some spectacular public lands not too far from here. And we have an opportunity, and I'm trying to do this in this bill, to designate some new wilderness areas, especially areas that are that were left out of prior wilderness designations, but are natural extensions of existing wilderness. We have an opportunity to do all kinds of restoration work for coho salmon, and for healthier forests and fire resiliency. We have an opportunity for new trails and visitors centers, and maybe even in beautiful Redwood National Park where there's just not a lot of quality places to stay, maybe even some lodging. And so I have done this really big and ambitious public lands bill that includes wilderness and wild scenic rivers and also a working forest area, several 100,000 acres, where the revenue from that sustainable forestry to reduce fire threat would go back into salmon restoration and then remediating another problem we have up there, which is illegal marijuana trespass grows. So, yeah. All right. So, thanks. Look for that bill. It's a great bill, and I hope you'll support it.
Okay, this is a three questions from David. Did the NRA launder $30 million of Russian money into the Trump campaign? Is Rudy Giuliani a registered foreign agent? And how will you speak to GOP congressmen about solving climate change? 3 different questions.
Yeah, so the first 2 are much easier. Rudy Giuliani is deep into corruption with these foreign clients of his, and in fact, rumor has it that he had a one-way ticket to Vienna, and I'm not even kidding. I've heard that on some pretty good information. Watch Rudy Giuliani in these next few days, because the one thing we know is that Donald Trump not only surrounds himself with some pretty dubious people, but as soon as things go sideways, he doesn't hesitate to throw them right under the bus, and he's warming up the bus for Rudy Giuliani. The first one,
NRA,
did the NRA...
30 million
Right.
Russian.
Yeah, I don't know the specific amount. I don't know the specific amount, but there is abundant evidence that the NRA was involved in attempts to launder money into the Trump campaign, and I believe the inaugural fund for the Trump committee. So something that we need to get answers to from the NRA, certainly. And then the last piece was, how do you talk to Republicans about climate change? I think I spoke to this earlier. It's tough. I do have friends across the aisle, and we can talk about this. It's just very hard to get them to agree we need to reduce our reliance on fossil fuel. Even the ones who acknowledge climate change, actually reducing fossil fuel is a bridge too far. So what latest talking points from the Republicans, who I think are maybe reachable on this, tend to say, let's talk about innovation. But if you drill into that conversation, what they mean by innovation is more efficiently extracting oil and gas. And maybe using advanced oil recovery with some of that CO2, so it won't go into the atmosphere, but it'll go into these fossil fuel deposits to help us pull out even more fossil fuel that we can burn and pollute the environment with. So it's tough. The conversation is just not there right now, with the exception of someone like Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, who is a refreshing change. He is one of the few. There's a handful. There's Rooney from Florida. There's a handful of Republicans that actually you can talk to these things, about these things.
Okay, so Nicoletta has a suggestion and a question. The suggestion is a ban on political ads on all social media platforms to be in place until the process is proven to not be corrupt. That's a suggestion. Okay.
So the corrupt part of that, of course, is like Facebook not policing its platform, right? And I certainly share your frustration. I think banning all political ads would probably run afoul of the First Amendment, and I doubt that we're going to be able to actually do that. But I am happy to try to hold Facebook and other social media platforms to accountability, because they've been part of the problem. I agree.
Okay. And the second part of Nicoletta's was actually the question: what are the legislative plans to fix our infrastructure? We're falling apart one bridge at a time.
So let me be very candid with you about why there is not already a bipartisan infrastructure bill, a huge multi-trillion-dollar bill. There's bipartisan support to do this. And I could even find a whole bunch of Republicans that would join me in raising the gas tax, for example, as a way to fund it. But that's where we begin to break down, because neither side trusts the other when it comes to putting your neck out politically on how you pay for it. And the Republican leadership is really nervous about letting any of their members vote for a gas tax, because they're worried that they'll be primaried for raising a tax, for violating the whatever pledge to Grover Norquist they all signed off on, right? And the Democratic leadership, so let me cast blame on both houses here. The Democratic leadership won't let us get out ahead. I mean, we could come up with our own pay for, right? And we could just pass something and try to bring Republicans along, and we could get some Republican votes. But the Democratic leadership is nervous about having us do that until Donald Trump says, and you can't really trust him anyway, but I guess until Donald Trump says, I will support that. And he hasn't said that. So we're stuck. And in the meantime, you have this terrible problem of neglected infrastructure. I have been advocating that we should just move ahead, that we should take the political risk of passing something, come up with the most thoughtful pay-for we can put together, grab the Republicans' friends that we can find, and pass it, and then put the pressure on the Senate and the President if they want to oppose it. But so far, I've been unsuccessful in that effort.
Okay, we're down to our last two questions. So
Okay.
this one's from Kimberly. Kimberly wants to know what we can do to keep Trump's hands off the nuclear button. This is essential to ensure the welfare and safety of our country. It's critical. He's not mentally fit. And where does this evaluation and determination come in? What will we do about it?
Yeah, we worry about Trump's hands in lots of places, don't we? Here's what I can tell you. I have co-sponsored legislation by my colleague Ted Lieu that would codify no first strike authority for the president. And in the past that's been debated. We've never actually made that law. But I think with President Trump especially, it's probably time to just make it crystal clear that a president of the United States cannot use first strike authority with nuclear weapons, period.
Okay, we're last question.
Last question.
Yeah. So Maureen asks, so much of the news from Washington is negative. Please tell us some positive changes that have been accomplished or will be accomplished.
Okay, good. That's a great note to end on. Thank you for that. So I'll tell you, I already mentioned that the special education bill I've been co-sponsoring is actually going to get a hearing. We've got over 100 bipartisan co-sponsors. I think for the first time in a long, long time, we may be on the path to providing a lot more support for IDEA and special education, and I think that's a really good thing. The second thing I'll say is you probably didn't even read about this, but there's a federal salmon restoration project underway on the San Joaquin River. I worked on it when I was in a prior life when I was an NRDC attorney, but it was to try to get the Central Valley Project in California to release enough water from Friant Dam to bring back salmon that had been totally extirpated 50 years ago, because when they built this dam in the 1940s, they took all the water. They dried up the second largest river in California. And as a result of that litigation, we got a court order that flows had to come back, and we invested in some water supply solutions for the growers down there. But fast forward to right now, they said it couldn't happen. They said that spring-run salmon could not survive below Friant Dam, and as of right now, there are 117 salmon reds from adult spring run who survived their entire life cycle from Fresno out to the Pacific, swimming God knows where for several years, and made it all the way back through the Delta to Friant Dam, and thousands of salmon are going to be bred this year as a result of that. So that's good news. All right, hey, thanks everyone. I sure appreciate you joining me. We'll have more of these.